Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Canadian Heritage.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to address motion M-103, introduced by the member from Mississauga, Aaron Mills. This motion calls on this House to recognize the need to quell the increasing public climate of hate and fear and condemn Islamophobia and all forms of systemic racism and religious discrimination. The motion calls on the Standing Committee of Canadian Heritage to study how to develop a whole-of-government approach to reducing systemic discrimination and racism, including Islamophobia, and report back to this chamber. The Standing Committee would make recommendations to better reflect our enshrined rights and freedoms and examine how the government should collect data on hate crimes and conduct needs assessments for impacted communities. Mr. Speaker, as the Parliamentary Secretary for Multiculturalism to the Minister of Heritage, I'm proud to state in this chamber that our government supports motion M-103. I'm proud to be able to stand here today to recognize the importance of overcoming all forms of systemic racism and religious discrimination in Canada, in particular the pressing issue of Islamophobia, with a view to building a more equitable society grounded in the important values of inclusion and acceptance. Canada
is one of the most diverse countries in the world. In our country, people of all horizons, migrants and refugees from across the globe, live and work together and contribute to the rich and magnificent mosaic that we know today. I'm a product of this national experiment. As Muslim refugees from Uganda, some 45 years ago, we arrived here. And now, today, I am a parliamentarian. The member for Mississauga, Arundel, as well, is the same as colleagues in this House who were born abroad and who come from some 41 different countries. Our country is made up of people of various horizons, language, culture, religion. Muslims, Buddhists, Sikhs, Hindus, Jewish people, Christians, and many other religious communities live together in solidarity. Our proud Francophone and Anglophone communities alongside Aboriginal communities. There are people who have first languages other than English and French. Our country continues to evolve and to diversify. And between now and 2036, some 30% of the population of Canada, working Canadians, will be members of a visible minority. And the percentage could increase to 65% in Toronto and to more than 60 in Vancouver. Now, if I'm emphasizing this, Mr. Speaker, it's to identify our multicultural populations, but also to acknowledge that this is our diversity since Confederation. People of various cultural and ethnic horizons, of different religions, have contributed to the success of our nation in the 150 years since Confederation.
Significant challenges remain. The terrorist attack that occurred at a Quebec mosque on January 29th was a tragic reminder of the persistence of hate in our society and how such hatred can have deadly consequences. As a Muslim Canadian and as a member of this chamber, my initial reaction to the shootings was shock and horror, followed by rage and anger, and eventually mourning for the senseless loss of innocent lives. Indeed, Canadians of all backgrounds are still grieving across the country, and our hearts go out to the victims and their families. But this incident should not be viewed in isolation, Mr. Speaker. It must be seen in context, and that context is one of growing intolerance. Growing intolerance fueled in part by the politics of division, where groups have driven wedge issues in an attempt to divide the electorate for partisan gain. Mr. Speaker, I reject outright the characterization by the member from Cypress Hills Grasslands that somehow the Liberal Party has been responsible for this politicization. Our party and our government stands against the politics of division. Growing intolerance has manifested in escalating actions. Take, for example, the appearance of racist posters targeting members of the Sikh community that surfaced in Alberta. Subsequent to the Quebec terror attack, we've witnessed anti-Semitic graffiti in Ottawa, Islamophobic insults hurled at passengers on the Toronto transit system. These incidents cast a shadow on our reputation as a peaceful, tolerant, and inclusive society, and remind us of the vital need for initiatives such as Motion M-103. They are a reminder, as the member for Louis Hebert put it so passionately in this chamber 2 weeks ago, that we must never be complacent in the face of racism and discrimination. Instead, we must confront it in all its forms. Mr. Speaker, Canadians have started to do so. In the wake of the horrible shootings in Quebec, we've also seen a broad outpouring of solidarity, support, and compassion from Canadians across the country. We've seen thousands braving freezing temperatures to mourn the innocent loss of life at vigils. We've seen Jews and Christians gather to form circles of protection around mosques to give worshippers a sense of safety and security for their Friday Juma prayers. We have seen, in my very own riding of Parkdale High Park, the development of interfaith dialogue groups to better understand one another's religions in the hope of breaking down barriers. But fostering an inclusive and compassionate Canada that we aspire to, where difference is not only tolerated but celebrated, Mr. Speaker, requires vigilance. It requires a rededication to the task of rooting out systemic racism and religious discrimination, which is precisely what this motion seeks to do. But this attempt at remaining vigilant has come up against a few objections, which I will turn to now. The first is that condemning Islamophobia will serve to limit the freedom of speech of those who have genuine concerns about Islam and its tenets. Nothing could be further from the truth, Mr. Speaker. There is nothing in this motion that would curb or limit the constitutionally protected right to freedom of expression guaranteed under Section 2B of the Charter. But let me go further. I know that we as Canadians, Mr. Speaker, will never be able to truly overcome intolerance and build a more inclusive country unless we are able to have candid, open and respectful discussions about the challenges presented by a changing and rapidly diversifying population and pose honest questions. As a Muslim, I have those questions myself, Mr. Speaker, and I pose them regularly to religious leaders in my own community. But make no mistake, M-103 is not about limiting respectful discussion, Mr. Speaker. It is about curbing hatred. M-103 is about all members of this House standing up and affirming that racism and discrimination, whether it be towards Muslims, Jews, Black Canadians or Indigenous groups or any others, runs contrary to the values we hold dear as Canadians. In this context, I want to address the plethora of misinformation and fear-mongering about M-103 circulating on social media. This motion is not about bringing Sharia law to Canada, Mr. Speaker. Such statements are pure conjecture and should be rejected out of hand because they lack any merit. But on top of the erroneous information circulating on social media, it is the abuse that we have witnessed which concerns me. The online attacks that are circulating about this motion are just that, Mr. Speaker, attacks. They illustrate quite directly the climate of hatred which this motion recognizes. These online attacks constitute abuse and insults meant to intimidate and shut down discussion, not promote it. Our government wants to have a discussion because discussion is vital to building a more inclusive country. By calling for a parliamentary committee to study systemic racism, Mr. Speaker, M-103 fosters freedom of expression. It doesn't limit it. The second objection we have heard, and we heard it again this evening, is that this motion is flawed because it singles out the vague term Islamophobia for special consideration. I have several responses to this. First of all, reaching a resolution on this matter is not a question of Prime Minister's office approval. It is a private member's motion that has been brought by the member from Mississauga, Erin Mills. We have heard her response this evening, and let me reiterate her response on why Islamophobia is important to enumerate. First, understanding what we mean by Islamophobia is not difficult, Mr. Speaker. When we speak about Islamophobia, we're not talking about legitimate questions about a religion or respectful criticisms of religious practices. When we speak about Islamophobia, we're talking about taking a stand against prejudice, against abuse, against discrimination targeted toward individuals for no reason other than the fact they practice Islam. Second, singling out a particular religion has precedent, Mr. Speaker. As the member for Wellington Halton Hills has observed, this House has a long tradition of passing motions denouncing discrimination and hatred against particular groups, such as Jews, Yazidis, Egyptian Coptic Christians. Third, Mr. Speaker, the motion enumerates Islamophobia because words matter. It is incumbent on we as parliamentarians to use words which accurately depict and call out by name the intolerance we are observing, that we are honest with the facts which show an overall increase in the number of hate crimes in this country against Muslims. While all of us in this chamber stand opposed to all instances of racism and discrimination, Mr. Speaker, 24 days after 6 Muslim men were gunned down in cold blood in a mosque simply because of their religion, it is incumbent upon this government and this Parliament to signal to Canadians that we recognize that there is an acute problem with anti-Muslim sentiment and that we are committed to working steadfastly to address it. If we can't call out Islamophobia now, at this juncture, Mr. Speaker, when will it ever be appropriate to do so? Mr. Speaker, our government supports M-103. I do, and I urge all members of this House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming